Peace everybody, my name is Blaney. The gist of this channel is to explain reality in a way that makes it the most useful for our lives. And that includes being able to invent anti-gravity machines or free non-toxic energy, or how to understand what does it mean E equals mc squared. Like, yeah, mass and light are equivalent, but how are they equivalent? Now, if you want to understand yourself, you need to know what you're made of and what you make up. What's inside you and what you're inside. And it turns out that the universe is a nested series of fluid flow. That is, the tornadoes that we see in the sky and have inside them smaller tornadoes that have the same qualitative flow patterns and that give the same inertial density. In the same sense, we're part of a bigger vortex in the spiraling, for example, Milky Way. I have a theory which I don't claim to be completely new or different. What it does is it shows you what I feel is missing in the current theories out there, and what I've concluded that's a very satisfying view of reality. And it happens to be based on a view from the viewpoint of me, a fluid mechanical engineer expert. That was my expertise, was fluid mechanics and mass transfer. When you're getting your doctorate in chemical engineering, you do take a lot of courses on physics. Okay, so then I have the basics of physics. And I'm taking what's out there, and of course, like a lot of us, studying this for our entire lives, many decades, and then you start to put the pieces together, and every time I read the viewpoint of someone else that's really smart, like David Bohm or Einstein, you know, it's like, okay, this matches them. In fact, some, like for example, some of the things that I talk about etheric flux are really warped space-time, but I didn't ever like that language because I couldn't see it as a warped space-time. But etheric flux means something to me. It's a visceral fluid that flows and accelerates. And you can actually view it in a video with dots that shows the flow of the fluid as it accelerates. The really special thing about this theory of etheric flux is that not only can you explain it in words to people that don't even want to learn the math, and they can understand it, as long as you can understand that how the oceans flow and how the rivers flow, you've watched them, you know how they flow, you see the tornado twisting, you see the hurricane going in a circle, right? So you know generally how fluids flow. We all do. It's part of living. So if you can understand fluid flows, the nested universes all are based on a flowing fluid. In fact, the entire universe is made of a giant fluid of zero viscosity, zero density, infinite turbulence. And as the swirls and the whirls build up in nested layers, you get this gyroscopic inertia that is nested within bigger gyroscopic inertias. And as this builds up, it causes a density of this fluid. And on our size scale of our lives, we see this fluid as what we call the 0 point field, and we know that it's full of energy and turbulence and things churning around. We say there's particles popping into and out of existence. We call them virtual particles, but I would like to beg to differ and use the language of they're temporary to us, but those particles that spring into and out of existence might have lots of lifetimes inside of them because things move so quickly at that level. From our clocks, you see, but to them it's very slow. So by starting with the premise of the universe as a fluid from the viewpoint of a chemical engineer with fluid dynamics training and the understanding of the fluid mechanical equations, then we can start to look at the universe in a new way, like fluid. And we can say, well, let's compare it to all the things that we know are true and see if it matches. And it certainly matches all of Einstein's theories of relativity, special relativity, general relativity. This does not disagree with that at all, but it adds additional information, additional understanding of what's really going on. Did Einstein ever tell us how mass and light are interconnected? How does one convert to the other? Well, I will explain that with this simple viewpoint of looking at the universe as a fluid. I think the benefit of my spiritual training and pursuits, as combined with scientific training and pursuits, has given me the opportunity to be able to explain the spiritual with mathematics. So the mathematics, okay, so the language of explaining the visceral flow of the ether and how it makes us up and how our intention can control our reality, it's all in the flow of the ether and the fact that the ether is our consciousness as it moves. The moving ether that's accelerating and making patterns is our consciousness. It doesn't create our consciousness. Consciousness doesn't create it, but it is. It's the same thing. If you want to, you could say they co-create each other, because we have sort of an idea of what consciousness is, and we have an idea of what accelerated fluid is, and they don't seem to mesh. So for now, you could just say, well, they co-create each other. As the fluid moves, the consciousness arises. That would be another way you could look at it. Using my theory of etheric flux, I really want to explain a lot of the current physics questions that we have. What's dark matter? What's dark energy? Easily explained, especially on a visceral heuristic level. And the actual mathematics would be necessary if you're going to design things or predict things. But you can understand it without the mathematics if you can understand fluid flows, which is always curved, always spiraling, and there's a reason why it tends to spiral inward. So I want to explain all the physical forces. That would be the strong and weak nuclear forces, charge, repulsion and attraction, and the gravitational forces to start with. And all of these can be explained with this etheric theory. To understand yourself, as I said a minute ago, you must understand what you're part of and what is part of you. And so that's why we will then introduce the theory of etheric flux as a fluid. And the beautiful thing about the etheric flux view is that after I explain to you viscerally what it is in this video, the understanding is actually a parsable theory. In other words, everything I say can be expressed in a matrix of vectors that explains the acceleration of the ether in three-dimensional space and time. Now, if you want to use your mathematics to make a very, very small rotation and I guess radius of curvature, and it's so small that you don't have a calculator big enough to hold that small data, then you might split that off into another dimension. But in reality, it's really just 3D, the way this fluid flows. And it might have these weird patterns that it flows in the 3D. But okay, so I'm going to shift to just talking about another thing that this theory will explain is what is an electron? What is a photon? And then how do you convert one to the other? So E equals mc squared. How does that work? And so I'll start with the photon because that's easier than the electron, because the electron's made of a photon that ate its tail. Okay? The photon has a gravity because it's inwardly accelerating ether flowing in a tornado that makes up the photon. Flows at the speed of light according to our instruments. When space-time around this photon is warped properly, it happens to find its head warped in the position of its tail. And if it flows in, and if it sucks itself inside itself like an Ouroboros or a snake eating its tail, then it forms into a toroid. And that's how I propose that a light wave is formed into an electron, which is a toroid. And all mass particles are light that is condensed in this or similar ways. So another thing I would like to address using my theory of etheric flux and in this video series is how this theory can explain really what's going on in the wave-particle duality. I will explain the holographic universe in the language of etheric flux. This is what I'm proposing. If your bicycle tires are spinning really fast and you hit a bump or someone hits you and tries to knock you over or something, it'll kind of hold you up straight, you know, because it has that memory of that motion. And that's why gyroscopes are kind of hard. Like if you have a wheel turning, they're kind of hard to move this way and that way because they have this kind of round momentum that keeps them going that way. Well, same at a small scale. An electron has this not only movement this way, but it has this kind of inward movement this way too. So it has all these levels of gyroscopic rotation that contain within it entities that also have gyroscopic rotation. This adds up from size equals 0 up to infinity, and adds up to form a finite non-zero number. And that's, you know, the inertia that we experience, okay? So this gyroscopic phenomenon gives the electron sort of it doesn't just exist in an instant. Nothing exists in an instant because everything's in flux. So everything has a past and a future. There's never just a now. It has because it has a velocity. Now, mathematically, you know, every instant in time, your mathematics would show that at this point in time, the particle was here, you know, the electron. That's not really a particle. Wink, wink. And so at that moment in time, it has a velocity vector and an acceleration vector, and maybe, you know, the derivative of the acceleration all up to infinity, all the derivatives. But the main thing is the acceleration vector is what characterizes it, what characterizes its flow for the purposes of our talk. Etheric flux is an ocean of very slippery fluid, like you'd imagine a plasma, but it's even less dense than a plasma. It's slippery, and it's like supercooled fluid. You know how the whole reason why supercooled fluids are so cool is because there's no friction. So it's like that. It's just completely friction free, no density, no viscosity. Now, David Bohm and Karl Pribram, I think they were both at Stanford, proposed that the universe was a giant hologram and that it contains, and I'll quote, matter and consciousness as a single field. And they may be saying exactly what I'm saying, but, you know, I have to say that I don't know who wrote this about their theory, but I want to add that the universe is a giant hologram that contains, I don't want to call it a hologram, I'm just going to say it's a big ocean of fluid that contains ether, which is the 0 point field, and all of light, which are tornadoes in the 0 point field, and all of matter, which are light condensed into the Ouroboros, small sizes. And then this flow goes all the way up to larger sizes, like nebula and black holes, for example. So that is what our universe is. We need to add it. It's not just matter and consciousness, but it's matter and consciousness and light and everything that those make up. Mainly I'm just adding light to the matter. And we can't leave out the valuable 0 point field particles. You know, that's what it all is. It's not just matter and consciousness, but the entire soup is one and the same with consciousness. And so now let me just talk about consciousness for a minute. Consciousness, what I mean by that is sort of if it gets sophisticated enough in terms of its complexity, it becomes intention. But at the same time, it is ultimately consciousness. The feeling of being, and I am, just that I am, okay? But when it becomes complex enough, because you've got these patterns of etheric flow that, you know, add to each other, they superimpose on each other, they interact with each other, and the things that are chaotic kind of die out. The things that have structure and resonance tend to reinforce each other, you know? And so these are the things that stick around and make matter and light, and that gives us a chance to exist. And we can now store information in these forms and communicate with each other. And now, because of all this communication, we have a sophisticated way to express our consciousness to the point of changing fate, because we now have a high-tech consciousness that can manipulate the future, manipulate the position of particles and the matter and the seeming particles and the shape of the 0 point field and the shape of the etheric wiggles. Since our intention is one with the etheric wiggles and our consciousness is one with the etheric wiggles, then wouldn't that imply that our intention could change it? And so at this point, I'm going to say that I want to use this theory ultimately for improving our lives, you know, using it to construct ways to get good energy that doesn't pollute. And then another way is how do we be happy? How do we think happy thoughts, and what is intention? How does it really work? You know, like a lot of people say, well, here's how it really works, but what they're really saying is, here's how to do it, and this worked for me. But how does it really work in terms of the real physics? Mathematically, for example, and wouldn't it be nice if it could be visceral? I see it this way, and it seems to explain everything, and it's 3 dimensions in time. So I want to share that, and I want to see what you think, and I want to, I guess I'm offering this as an alternative view because I think it's the missing link that's just keeping us stuck on, well, nobody knows what gravity is, nobody knows what mass is. So this theory, I didn't mention it yet, but I'm still getting there, of all the things I want to explain. I'm using my theory of etheric flux, and the most important is gravity. What is gravity? Well, I would say that's equally important to how does mass convert to light, and how does light convert to mass, because clean nuclear energy would be nice, right? But it's not clean, because it makes toxic waste products that decay for hundreds and millions of years, lots of years. So I want to explain what gravity is. And you know, you can't really build an anti-gravity machine unless you know what gravity is. Unless you find the technology in a UFO. Okay, so that's possible. But if you have to start from scratch, then you just need to know what gravity is so that you can know whether you can or can't manipulate it. So I did want to make a point about, another point about David Bohm and Carl Pribram's holographic theory. The model says that the vast ocean of waves and frequencies is what the universe is made of. And they appear solid to us because the brain converts the unfolded hologram, that's David Bohm's language, into unfolded physical matter. And if you've read any of David Bohm's books, you know what enfolded and unfolded means. And I think what he means by an unfolded physical material means that our conceptual view of the actual holographic universe, okay? But I'm saying, okay, rather than just calling it a holographic universe, I'm telling you what it is. I'm saying it's a fluid, zero viscosity, zero density, infinite turbulence that flows and makes patterns, and the gyroscopic motions of these patterns add one upon the other to where it forms a superimposed wave of everything that is. And this same fluid is consciousness. So my model says that the universe is a vast ocean of fluid waves which have frequencies and which appear solid to us due to the superposition of the waveforms and the condensed nature of the light. Now, light has gravity, okay, but we don't call it mass. When the light wave goes past us at the speed of c, its gravity is sort of temporary, and there's just a, you know, what I would feel if a light wave flew past my face is just this minuscule spread out force of fluid going into the light wave and in a kind of sucked in and carried along. But it's so brief that by the time you measure it, you don't know which photon did it, and by the time you measure it, you might have changed the path of the photon. So there's not really any way our instruments can measure the gravity of a single photon. I did propose in a long time ago in a video that I made, even on a different channel, that, you know, oh, well, if you had a super macho laser, you could probably generate some gravity, you know, if you had a constant flow of photons being generated. But so let's just say that they appear solid, particles appear solid due to the superposition of their waveforms into a big waveform. So I'm talking about the 0-point field particles are part of the bigger tornado that makes up the light wave, that makes up the toroid, that makes up the electron, that we see as mass. And it looks like mass to us because all these waveforms, which are superimposed upon each other, form a big waveform that begins to generate gyroscopic inertia from the nested gyroscopic flows of the ether within it. And it's concentrated in the condensed form of light. It's so concentrated that instead of zipping past us, it just sits there. And so it just keeps generating gravity by sucking in ether and sucking in ether and sucking in ether. And the ether accelerates into it constantly. It looks chaotic to us in certain regions, but it's actually filled with a plethora of coherent zero-point energy waveforms that add up to the bigger patterns, the tornadoes, the black holes. They're so complicated because there's so many different nested layers of flow that it appears in some regions chaotic. Now, there will always be other regions that don't appear chaotic, like the brain waves we generate when we're in heart-brain coherence. Our nerves are all firing at the same time. That's like a coherent dance of the etheric wiggles. But that's a rare find, and consciousness in the form of a human body is very, very rare, and that's why it's important to respect our opportunity to be occupying this human body so that we can do as much as we can to experience the universe in here with these facilities and these senses and these chakras, and do the best we can in this life, because that will then soon dissipate into another form. Our consciousness will remain, but this particular complexity in the form of it, which makes up our personality, will not. So the waveforms I'm talking about that superimpose upon each other are the single photon-photon pairs that exist together as a single waveform, and the electron-positron pairs that exist as a single waveform. That ultimately is superimposed on the rest of the waveforms of the universe, so that you get a net flow of the ether. And for example, in our human bodies, we have ether flowing into us because we're gravitational beings. We are made of condensed light, and light sucks in ether, so does our matter. So it flows in from where? Up there and down below. It flows in from all directions into our toroids, and the Earth is actually pulling that ether through us. But some of it gets detained in our own matter. And then we as a massive body are also pulling in ether from up there and also from the Earth. So since we're pulling ether up through the Earth, that makes its own vortex coming up through our body, and then the ether going from out there into our bodies makes a vortex going down. And so that's why you see a lot of these diagrams of the human body with a vortex going in and a vortex coming in from the ground. And these flows of ether are superimposed upon each other, and one's going down and one's going up. And in terms of the twisting, I'm assuming that they're also twisting in opposite directions as well. I know it's toroidal, and I want to share my view with you. Okay, so now I'm talking about condensed light is matter, and I know it's toroidal. And how do I know it's toroidal? Because of the process of deduction. When you start with a zero density, zero viscosity fluid with infinite turbulence, and you start building things with it, it follows that the toroid would form, okay, out after the vortex is formed at all size scales. And so that toroid, I have a mathematical model for it, and it's complicated. So the light which goes in a straight line is less complicated. The way to actually converge on the equations of the toroidal etheric acceleration vector field pattern is to start with the tornadic one, the vortex, and then just take that mathematics and do not a Laplace transform, but a transform that takes that linear model and curves it into a circle upon itself, and then superimpose, the backbone upon itself in an infinite loop. And so it would approach your final vector field expression of that toroidal information, okay, which includes the vector field for that acceleration at every point in space, okay. And I want to share that with you in these videos with the hope that it helps you and me to understand the structure of the universe, the structure of you and I, so that we can better understand what intention really is, and feel that, because you can't utilize intention to get what you want unless you believe it, unless you really believe that it's going to happen. How many of us can believe it? So I'm doing this for my own use because I want to be able to believe it. I want to be able to have a tangible way to explain it so that when I'm practicing intention, I really do believe it. And this is my way. I'm a scientist and I like to have explanations. That's what I'm about here in this channel. We are nested flows in the ether, both smaller and bigger than us. I'm open to suggestions, and I really want to help whatever little way I can to offer some viewpoints that don't already exist. And if I offer a viewpoint and it already exists, that makes me feel really good, because it means that it's probably right, and it gives me confidence that I'm thinking along the right lines. So far, I haven't come across any reason why this theory of etheric flux wouldn't be more useful than the way we look at things now, because I think it would get us further in our technological development. Okay, thanks. Peace.